Are you desperate enough? Have you come to the end of yourself? Because I would say no if you're not striking the ground and calling on Him. If you're not the persistent widow coming back again. Open up. I need justice. I need help. You're my only hope. Have you been there? Because my friend, it is in that desperation that those who are forgiven much, they love much. I'll add to it, they cling much. They follow much. They give much. Because they know where they come from, they recognize the source, and they recognize what He's saying about them. That whom the Son sets free is free indeed. That you don't have to live a life of addiction and brokenness and death and decay. It's time for some of you to get serious in this place. To let go of it all and say, I believe what you're saying. Well, the title of today's message is Strike the Ground. Strike the Ground. This is our second part of our series, Elisha. And this one is called Strike the Ground. Last week was Burn the Plow, the calling of Elisha, the calling by Elijah to Elisha. So we moved from our conversation on Elijah to Elisha. And now we've seen that Elisha has accepted the call. He has followed Elijah. He's counted the cost. And he has burned the plow so that there's nothing to come back to. And now Elisha has a long life, but we're going to skip to the end of his life. We're going to go back a little bit during the message and also discuss some of those things that happened in between and really trying to surmise his entire life as quickly as we can. But now we're going to start at the end and work backwards. And so the text we'll start in is in 2 Kings chapter 13. 2 Kings 13. We'll start in 14 and we'll go through 19. I'm going to go ahead and read that. Now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, draw the bow. And he drew it. And Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands, and he said, open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot. And he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have an end of them. And he said, take the arrows. And he took them. And he struck. He said, take the arrows. And he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground with them. And he struck the ground 3 times, and then he stopped. Then the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times. And so we have gone through 19 there. The first thing I want to do is give you guys a background of who Joash is. We know a little bit about Elisha at this point. Joash is the other character here. He's the king of Judah. So remember, there's a division in the kingdom under Solomon's son Rehoboam. They split into 2 parts. There's a faction in the kingdom, and we have the kingdom of Judah, which is of the line of David, which possesses Jerusalem, Temple Mount, and the hill country of Judea. And then you have Israel, that is going to be a northern kingdom. But they are all Jewish. It's just a divided Jewish kingdom. It was united under Saul. It was united under David. It was united under Solomon. Then Rehoboam comes along, and it's divided under his poor leadership. And so we have these 2 kingdoms. We're talking about the king of Judah and the king of the area of Jerusalem and Temple Mount, which is very important today. Did you guys know that there was once a king, or should I call it a king-queen, maybe not the right terminology today. That might make you think of something else. But the first woman to reign as king in Jerusalem and over Judah. Only one woman has ever reigned as king over Jerusalem and the tribe of Judah. Her name was Athaliah. Athaliah. Her son Azariah was king, and Azariah dies. And then when Azariah dies, Athaliah, his mother, then proceeds to kill all of the male heirs. Now do the math there. Do the Jerry Springer math. Those are her grandsons. She's the mother of the king. The king dies. She wants to take control of the kingdom and the throne, and she kills all of the male heirs, her grandbabies. Not the best representation of the only woman king of the Jewish people. Now, don't get me wrong, there have been women in leadership. I think I need to state that. Deborah is one of the judges of Israel, who is really the leader of Israel, but those were in the time of judges and not kings. And so Athaliah is a murderous woman. This is stuff that movies are made of. She's murdered her grandchildren, but one grandchild is hidden away. Guess who that is? Joash. The person that we're talking about today, Elisha and Joash, the king. Now, Joash is hidden away. He's 1 year old. He's a baby. He can't walk. He can't control himself. He has no hand-eye coordination. He's a little baby. Baby Joash is now the only heir in line for the throne. So, a woman takes him, actually the sister of Azariah, the king that has passed, takes her nephew, Joash, and hides him. She takes him to the priest at the temple in Jerusalem. That's why it's important that we understand where this is happening. And so to do that, I can give you kind of a layout. And then on the right, what you're going to see is the arrow pointing to the palaces, where Joash is taken from, where Athaliah is reigning, and the arrow pointing upward is going to show you where Joash was taken. So Joash is being concealed in the temple there with the high priest, and it's just a stone's throw from the palace of Athaliah. Just want you to grasp that concept, that this heir to the throne is just a stone's throw from the murderous woman who wants this child dead. So this 1 year old child is taken to the temple where he's cared for by the priest, Jehoiada. And there he's being kept away for 6 years. For 6 years, he's being sheltered there in that area. The next thing you're going to see is a recreation of Solomon's temple. I'm not sure where they hid him, but Temple of Solomon, we don't have the remnants of that today. You can visit the remnants of Herod the Great's temple, the temple that Jesus interacts with, but somewhere in that vicinity is the Temple of Solomon, the ancient Temple of Solomon. And it would have been much smaller than modern day Temple Mount, but it was a place nonetheless where Joash was hidden. I don't know where he was hidden. I'm sure it was somewhere in one of the side rooms instead of in the holy place or the Holy of Holies. I don't think that would happen. And so he's somewhere in one of these outer rooms or somewhere close to the temple. He's being cared for by the high priest. And he's in hiding from the murderous woman king, Queen Athaliah. And so we move on to our first point, talking about the redeemed ones. The redeemed ones. Redeemed from bondage. Rescued from bondage. Galatians chapter 4. I'm going to read those for you, just to give us an idea. So we've got Joash, who's been rescued from death, from bondage, and he's been freed. He's being kept by the priest in the temple, and so he's being rescued. But I want you to think for a second about your rescue. The rescue that happened in your life. Galatians chapter 4, verse 9 says this, "But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once again?" I'm going to turn the page there and read in chapter 5, verse 1 of Galatians. "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery." So we see that Joash has been rescued. I want you to think about your rescue for a minute. We all have different stories, and I've heard many of them. Some have been thrown in a ditch and left for dead. Some have OD'd and flatlined on an operating table and have been brought back to life. Life in shambles and the bondage of the past. Yesterday we did interviews here for the Overcomers TV network, and one of the questions they were asking us, including myself, is, what do you hate about addiction? What do you hate and loathe about the bondage of the past? And if I were to think about that for a minute today, I would say that what I hated the most was separation from God. But then I dig a little deeper into the feelings felt in those moments, the desperation, the heart of an animal that took over, a heart that cared for nothing but cravings, that was willing to reject family, to steal from family, to reject God, for an insatiable craving for the life of addiction. I can remember crawling on the ground for one more crumb. The desperation in my heart, as feeling as if I was turned inside out after all the money was spent and I had been up for 5 days and I couldn't sleep still on the back porch trying to find little cigarette butts that I could smoke a little further because I'd ran out, where I'm just dying inside and I literally would rather die than be there. Come on, somebody. Have you been there? Can you remember the pain and the anguish and the bondage as we were drug around from place to place because of our addiction, made to do things that we would have never done as a young man, stealing, hurting others? Everything had gone out the window. I think it's important that we remember that today as we remember this young boy who was rescued. We need to think about our own rescue. What I love about the story of Joash is that he's rescued, but he's rescued and he's placed in the temple. I love that because that's exactly what happened in my life. And this is the temple for me. Sonrise Adult and Teen Challenge. It was a place I found refuge in 1996. It's a place I found refuge in 2007. It's the cleft of the rock. It's the shadow of the Almighty. It's a place where a dead man could be drugged and come back to life. That same guy on that back porch dying inside who didn't want to live anymore. It's a place where I could come back to life and feel again. I could hope again. I could be released from the bondage that I was under. How beautiful is it that Joash he's taken to the temple. And who is he being cared for by? The high priest and the priests in the temple. I want you to think about that for a minute. Who are we being cared for by here? The high priest. And I'm not talking about Josh Whitley. I'm not talking about Josh West. I'm talking about the high priest, Jesus. The one spoken of in Hebrews. The great high priest that all high priests look toward. That cares for our soul. That when we open the Bible in the morning, as if we were Joash in the temple and the high priest is teaching us the Torah, the Old Testament laws. We're opening the Bible in devotions and God is teaching us and guiding us. And isn't it so miraculous at times that the very things that we're going through just are illuminated from the Scripture that morning? That the very things we're going through and that we've been reading then is preached in chapel. That God gives confirmation after confirmation and speaks into your life. So rest, my friend, in divine protection. Realize what this place is, and as soon as you do, you'll begin to love it. For some of you new guys, you're like, yeah, never. This is my last plan in life to come to this miserable place. Some of you have been here 6 months, still think that way. I pray that you come around. I still talk to friends to this day. Just the other day, talking to a buddy about this place, and he said, man, I didn't appreciate it like I should have when I was there, but I've grown to love that place. When you're placed in the temple, are you grateful for it? When you've been rescued from the murderous queen, are you grateful for it? When He's brought you to a place of salvation and restoration and shelter, have you embraced that yet? I'm going to tell you, it's going to be hard to learn anything until you embrace it. And you surrender to the divine protection that He's placed in your life. Joash is being brought up for 6 years. Joash was on a 6-year program. Not 13 months. Not 6-month resto. Joash was being brought up, discipled by priests for 6 years. And this baby becomes a boy under the tutelage of the priest in the temple. Then the next thing we're going to see in chapter 11, verse 4 through 12. I've summed up most of this for time's sake, but I do want to read this part going back a little bit in chapter 11, verse 4 through 12. Really, I don't want to read that because I don't have time, but I do want to bring out a couple of points here. And the point that we're going to mainly be looking at is, 1, rest in His divine protection, remain in the sanctuary, the provision that God has created for your life, and revolt against the world system. So now, Joash has been brought up. Now he's 7 years old. And it's time for him to adorn the crown of the king of Judah. 7 years old. He's a young king. There have been younger. But he's going to be the king of this area. So let me just give you a few things. Verse 9 says, the captains did according to all that Jehoiada the priest had commanded. What did Jehoiada the priest command? That they all arm themselves. So those coming on duty for Sabbath and those leaving duty for Sabbath all stayed together. So normally the first shift would go home. But the first shift stays. The second shift at the temple, the guards of the temple, stays. And so you have all of the guards of the temple there. Jehoiada arms them. How does he arm them? Verse 10, and the priest gave to the captains the spears and the shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house. Around the altar, we're talking about the brazen altar here, outside of the holy place, and the house on behalf of the king. So here, 7-year-old Joash is brought out. A crown is placed on his head. Jehoiada arms the others that are there, the guards that are there to guard the temple, and he arms them with David's warfare and his weapons. I mean, David must have had a collection. We know that at one point, the sword that killed Goliath was placed in the temple. Because at one point, David went back and got it. So we know that they're adorning his weapons to some degree, and they're going to use those. And so Jehoiada takes advantage of that opportunity, gives them spears and shields and swords from the collection of David. I'm sure additional swords and shields. I doubt there were enough to arm these massive amounts of soldiers, all from David's equipment, but I can't say that definitively. But regardless of the situation, they're all armed. Now you got the picture. You're on Temple Mount. We saw a picture of the Temple of Solomon. There's Jehoiada the priest. There are all the guards with all of the weapons, and there is 7-year-old Joash with a crown on his head standing in the middle. That's where we find ourselves. There is a revolt that's going to happen. The king, Athaliah, has been reigning for 6 years. You can imagine her reign. If she's killing her grandbabies, she's probably not a great queen. She is one of the worst. And so, there's a revolt that's happening. Now I want you to put that into your perspective today for your life. When it's time to be released from this place, when all of the training has happened, the discipleship and the upbringing, that when it's time to be released from this program, it's not time to relax. It's not that it's all been done and over with and now you can go back to normal life. What you'll realize here is that you've only been equipped to war. That this world is directly opposed to what we teach here. It is complete opposites. It is satanic Bible opposites. The gospel says, love your neighbor. Pray for those who spitefully use you. The satanic Bible says, get over on whoever you can get over on and hurt anyone who hurts you. Isn't that the gospel of the world? An antichrist gospel? So there's this kingdom of Ataliah, this kingdom of Satan that is opposed to the kingdom of God, to the teaching in the temple. Here's Joash been raised up in the temple. Now he's being released into a dark world. Isn't that just like our lives? Where we're going to be bombarded with lust at every turn. Instagram's going to give image after image. That's going to try to hook you and then lock you into a sequence and then travel down that rabbit hole. So ultimately you'll end up in pornography and lust of heart. It's going to say that man, you're going through depression. You know what you need is a little THC to deal with your depression. Let me tell you what you don't need. Some 99% THC in your system. Let me tell you what you don't need. Some concentrated dabs to take you out of your mind. It's just those little hooks that bring us in, that take us to that altered place when God has called us to be directly opposed to this world. We talked about this in great detail when it comes to the children of Babylon. That we are born here, but we don't belong here. We're children of Babylon, but we have temporary citizenship because we should be living for a kingdom whose builder and maker is God. If your life looks more like the world than it does the sanctuary and the temple and the things taught in His Word to be sober and vigilant, the wine is a mocker and beer a brawler, that all these things that the Bible warns us against, and if we still want to dabble in that, I'm going to tell you every time you'll lose. But if you come out of this place and God's tutelage and the upbringing by Christ Himself, and you come into a world that is directly opposed, and you stand fist up and say, I'm not going to conform. I'm not going to live by the standards of this world. I'm going to live by the standard of the Word. Then, my friend, you will come in direct contradiction to what the world teaches. I'm telling you, it's time. And there will be a time when you are released into a dark and perverse place. My question, friend, is how will you stand? Second point, recognizing your source. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. But now we are going back now to chapter 13. But what I just want to give a real summation real quick of Joash. So Joash is crowned king. Ataliah hears all the commotion. The queen king hears all the commotion in the temple. So she goes into the temple. Remember how close that was? She could hear what was happening. I showed you how close it was. Her kingly household, given by ultimately the kingdom of David, that she received by killing her grandchildren. And then the temple just a stone's throw away. She hears what's happening. She's that close. He's been hiding that close. And she runs there to see all the commotion. And she looks and she sees 7-year-old Joash, the one she missed, wearing a crown. And she says, treason, treason. She completely opposes what's happening. But then Jehoiada the high priest says, take her outside the temple. We don't want to kill her in the temple. Takes the wicked woman who was deserving of death, being murderous, killing her own grandchildren, They drag her outside the temple. They end her life. Then King Joash takes the throne. What you see in the kingdom of Joash is a restoring of the temple. At that point, the temple of God had been neglected. Some of the articles of the temple had been taken and used for Baal worship. We talked a lot about Baal, the supposed storm deity that Elijah confronts on Mount Carmel. So we have this temple that's been broken down. So he's being kept in a dilapidated temple, but now that he becomes king and he's been brought up by the high priest, he restores the temple. He takes an offering, he puts a box in the tabernacle, and when people go there, they give money for the restoration of the temple, and the temple is restored under Joash's reign. So Joash is a good king. A good 7-year-old king, a good 8-year-old king, a good 9-year-old king. Ultimately, he grows up to be a man, and that's where we find ourselves in chapter 14 in his interaction with Elisha. So this is almost a two-part message about two pillars, or a pillar and a prophet. Joash being a pillar and Elisha being a prophet, as we end this section on Elisha. So that's just to catch you up. Now we're at that situation we read earlier where Elisha is in the room with Joash. Now you know who Joash is. You know who Elisha is. They're in the same room together. Joash has cried out and said, the chariots are running against us. And there's an army that has come to besiege Jerusalem and take over. And Joash is calling for the man of God to come and speak. And so Elisha shows up. I want you to think about for a minute the source here. So he's asking for the man of God to show up. When we're in the world and battles happen and struggles happen, who are you going to call? You going to call Ghostbusters? Are you going to call Jesus? Who are you going to call? You going to call Saul? Or are you going to call Jesus, Yeshua, HaMashiach, the Messiah? He calls on the only man he knows that has a direct line to God, Elisha. Now, the first thing we see that when we look at Elisha, I'm having some issues here with the clicker today, is provision. So we see provision in Elisha. So I want you to recognize your source here. If we're calling on Jesus, what is the source? What does Jesus do for people? Who is he? If we're calling on Elisha in this case, Joash is, who is Elisha and what does he do? I promise you that every one of these characteristics is a characteristic of Christ. First of all, there's provision found. Elisha and Elisha have these miracle moments of provision. Now, for Elisha, there's a little bit of oil in a jar, and there's a woman who's owed a great debt, and Elisha performs a miracle, multiplies the oil so that she can go sell the oil and then go pay her debt. So there's provision found in this relationship from Joash to Elisha, that he understands who this man of God is. There should be an understanding in our hearts that we know who our source is, that there is provision found in him, that the birds of the air have no need for shelter. They have a nest, and the Father of heaven feeds them, that the lilies of the field are clothed more beautiful than Solomon in all his splendor, that we have provision in God. It may not be the prosperity that you want or think you need, but he provides. I can tell you story after story, and I can tell you my own. As a man who went through a 6-month restoration program while my wife was paying all the bills. And the miracle provision that came from places I can't, insane. A work crew that felt led to come to our house and get things in order because I was living in a flip at the time and it wasn't completely done and things weren't functional. And a work crew comes out of nowhere and wants to bless her and fixes up some areas in the house so that she can function while I'm in a program for 6 months. Some of you are in that place, that rock and hard place where there's a need, but there's not provision yet. You need to recognize your source and cling to him because he's the only one who can provide. And there's something he wants you to learn in the struggle. So we see there's provision. We see daily bread. There's daily bread provided. There's a moment where we see provision, where they're cooking a stew, and they put gourds in the stew, and the gourds poisoned the stew and made it taste terrible. Well, Elisha prays over that and purifies that stew. And there, all the soldiers are able to eat. We see that there is daily bread. Now, it doesn't say that there's daily feasts or daily cinnamon rolls. It says there's daily bread. There's bread enough to survive, and we should be grateful for that. We also see that he's a healer. There's a man named Naaman that has leprosy. When we recall Elisha's life, he has leprosy, and Elisha cures him by the power of God of leprosy. We see that he can do the impossible. In one moment, there's workers working, and there's an axe being used to chop down a tree. The axe head falls off and falls into the river. Anybody ever have that happen with an axe while you're swinging? The axe head falls off, falls into the river, sinks to the bottom. Elisha brings it to the top of the water. We see that he does the impossible. Then we see he has power over death. All these things, characteristics of Christ. Christ himself raises himself from the dead. So there's a boy that's died. A boy that actually came from a mother who was infertile, who Elisha spoke over and said, you will have a child. She has a child. Well, later that child dies. He goes to that child and brings him back. Another characteristic we saw in Elijah. So there's power over death. So if we're recognizing our source and who it is we're asking of, we need to recognize all these things that he guides. And we see that as we read that passage, that he's guiding Joash in picking up a bow and picking up arrows and drawing it back. We also see this in our own lives as he guides and teaches us. The Holy Spirit teaches and guides us. We see conviction. The conviction that comes at Teen Challenge to live a godly life. I've seen men after chapels come up to me and say, hey, I need to go down to my dorm and get you something. Stuff that they stole while they were living in the world that they felt convicted because it was in their care. A knife, a hammock, and a backpack. A man came up here and said, man, I stole these. I stole this from Walmart. I stole this from Academy. I just feel convicted. I want to give it, to Lovesick or somebody because, I don't want to benefit from something I stole anymore. There's conviction that happens. So all of these things we see in our lives. Most of them we see in Elisha's life. So if we're calling for God to do something in our lives, so we talked about the first point, we're broken, we found shelter, he's healing, he's guiding, and then we're clinging to the source here that is ultimately Christ in our case, Elisha in Joash's case, and we're remembering what he has done. And how do we know what he's done? Right here. This is what he's done. The power, the provision, the love, the compassion, the conviction, all of that from the person of Christ. Lastly, and we end with revelation of complete victory. So, revelation of complete victory. First thing I want you to do is remember. Remember the word over your life. Chapter 13, verse 17. The word is spoken right now to Joash. Now, Elisha knows who Joash is. Joash knows who Elisha is. He knows what he can do. He knows what's possible from this man of God. And this man of God tells him to pick up a bow, to pick up an arrow, to open the window to the east and to pull back that bow and to fire it to the east. We see that there's a word being spoken over him. Then we see the reasoning that can come in a moment like this. Like, why am I doing these silly exercises? Like, there's an army out there that's going to kill me. And I'm in here playing, Cowboys and Indians. I'm pulling back a bow and okay. Anybody ever feel like that? I'm doing these silly exercises. What is this? Jesus camp? I'm dying and I'm going to go to prison. Like, what are we doing here? You're wasting my time. Anybody? No? Let me tell you, my friend, it is in those menial things that you'll learn faithfulness. those small things and those struggles and those questionings that He will bring out faith in you and confront your doubt. So we have these reasonings in our own heart. Beware of negativity, beware of worry, and be leery of your narrow perspective. So receive the word spoken over you. This has been spoken over Joash, so he does it. He takes the arrows in his hands. And then lastly, we see a response. So this is the end of the story. And we're done. So he picks up the bow. He picks up the arrows. He opens the window. Elisha puts his hand on his hand and says, fire an arrow of victory over your enemies. And so he takes and he fires that arrow out of that eastern window. And then Elisha says, now take the arrows in your hand and strike the ground. This word's just been spoken over his life, the arrow of victory. Overcoming. The word of victory has been spoken over your life. That there is therefore now no condemnation, that if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation, the old is gone, and behold, the new has come. Do you believe that? When He's spoken that over your life, when you're pulling back that bow and He's speaking that into your heart, what's your heart doing? Is it like, yeah, I'll do this because you're telling me to do it. The Word says this. Maybe it applies to me, maybe it doesn't. A doubting man is like a wave of the sea tossed to and fro. Or do you believe what He said? Do you cling to His words like it is your life? Because I tell you, that day, that was Joash's life on the line. This army is going to invade and kill them all. And Elisha has just spoken this word of power and faith over his life. So he fires it out the window. Then he says, strike the ground. And Joash takes the arrows in his hand and he... 1, 2, is that enough? Okay, 3. And then Elisha rebukes him. He says, what's wrong with you, boy? That's paraphrased. That's the LDS version, Lauren David Treffler version. What's wrong with you, boy? You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. What's Elisha saying here? Here are the sources. Here are the man who's raised the dead, who floats axe heads, who takes his mantle and smacks the Jordan River and it parts so that he can walk across. All of this is in front of him. He knows the source, but he's not connected to it in faith and hope. He's not desperate enough. So much so, when he's proclaimed that he's got victory, when it's proclaimed over you that you're a new creation, okay, new creation, GS&C? PS&C? Devotion? I mean, here's half a page. Wait, is that good? No, it ain't good. It's not enough. If that man believed that, if his life was really on the line and he really believed that he had victory over that moment, how should he respond? He should be on the ground, pounding it for every last bit of his energy to say my wife is going to leave me, to say that my kids don't recognize me, to say that I'm dying and I need to live. Saying that I was dead inside and you rescued me. You brought me back from death and now I believe that you can do the impossible. God, I won't let go until you give me what you've called me to. That you pound the ground until you connect. That you hope that at some point in that moment, if you're just doing enough to get by, it ain't enough. It's not enough. Is it enough? Is that good? Elisha rebukes him. And I would rebuke you today. If you're standing on the line and you're just doing enough to get by. Are you desperate enough? Have you come to the end of yourself? Because I would say no if you're not striking the ground and calling on Him. If you're not the persistent widow coming back again. Open up. I need justice. I need help. You're my only hope. Have you been there? Because my friend, it is in that desperation that those who are forgiven much, they love much. I'll add to it, they cling much. They follow much. They give much. Because they know where they come from, they recognize the source, and they recognize what He's saying about them. That whom the Son sets free is free indeed. That you don't have to live a life of addiction and brokenness and death and decay. It's time for some of you to get serious in this place. To let go of it all and say, I believe what you're saying. Some of you might be at a place where you're like, Lord, I want to believe. There's something in me that doubts and questions and pushes back. But Lord, I want to believe what that says. You need to dig deeper. In the morning, you need to pound the ground in your devotionals. And I don't mean literally. I mean digging deep and taking every minute that you can, taking some free time and coming up to the chapel and giving your life in prayer because it's all ruined. It's all in ashes. Are you desperate enough and do you realize your need? And do you believe what He says? Because my friend, He's speaking it over you. You can be new. You can be free. You can be healed. Do you believe it? Then strike the ground. Let's pray. God, I thank You so much for these men. I thank You for their lives. I thank You for the place that they come. Lord, we even thank You for the desperation because without it, Lord, we just think that we've got enough. We've never got enough of Your word. We've never got enough of Your peace. We come to You today because You are the source and You're the only one who can redeem us. Rescue us and set us free. God, we figuratively strike the ground today. We don't want to let go of the altar. We don't want to let go of our devotionals. We don't want to let go of the class time and doze off. We want to wake ourselves up and dig deep because we realize that there's a lot at stake. Lord, may we strike the ground in all that we do. Lord, realizing what is at stake here. God, and we do that today. We lay our lives down at Your feet. If you're here today, and just for the sake of you standing in this program, and you feel like it's time to go deeper,